Hey everybody, in this video, we're going to welcome in Stacy Paterson, Senior Consultant from Parametrix, who will be presenting on a case study involving the Industrial Stormwater General Permit. In this case study, Stacy is going to talk about how her and her team helped the facility manage a third-party lawsuit and stay in compliance with the ISGP. Just a couple of notes before we get started, that Stacy did change some of the key details as well as the name of the facility to keep things anonymous. And I also missed the first about 20 seconds of the video, so we're just going to dive right into her presentation.
They were required to apply for the Industrial Stormwater General Permit under NAICS Code 562 for waste handling facilities and the fact that they were discharging to a surface water body. They received coverage under the permit, the 2020 permit, in February of 2020. Waste is stored under cover, and leachate from the waste goes into the sanitary sewer. There is a fueling area. You can see above ground storage tank. They have storage of tools and some support equipment outside. There's lots of heavy truck traffic at this facility. The facility itself is paved, but the entry road to the facility is not paved. All the roofs of the buildings are plumbed directly into the conveyance system. Stormwater system discharges directly to an impaired 303D listed water body, in addition to a Puget Sound sediment cleanup site. That water body is tidally influenced, and there are 2 sample points and 2 drainage areas at this facility. The sample points are affected by tides, and they can be affected by river flooding as well. In October of 2024, 4 years after they received the permit, they received a notice of intent to sue under the Clean Water Act by a citizens group, or what I'll call a third party. Okay, next slide. So I will talk about the receipt of the notice of intent to sue because I know that perks everybody's ears up. And, what do you do if you receive this type of a letter? I want you to immediately elevate it to your corporate staff and attorneys so that they can address it right away, because there is a time limit. So there's a 60-day time limit to prove that you are in compliance with that permit. And your goal is to show that within that 60 days. Because if you are in compliance, then the third party does not have standing or legal right to sue, and they'll have to withdraw the suit. So that happens very rarely, but it absolutely can happen. So you want to make sure you get on this right away. Now, in the notice of intent to sue, there's going to be violations that most likely the third party have found on the Water Quality Permitting, Reporting, and Information System, the PARIS website. So this is the public-facing site of your water quality portal that you are submitting your DMRs to, your annual reports. On that website, there shows any benchmark exceedances, but it also shows missing data. And so in that notice of intent, it's going to show, or it's going to show evidence of potential violations. And then there's also going to be some assumed violations. As you know, the permit requires a ton of paperwork and a ton of documentation. So that a lot of times is what's going to trip people up. So next slide, please. So for this particular site, the client's attorney contacted me to help with a compliance assessment to identify if they are in compliance with the ISGP and confirm that. So what my team would do is we come out, we go through all associated paperwork, such as looking through your sampling data, your current SWIP, associated documents, review that PARIS website and see what's actually on there, and then conduct a site visit where we'll evaluate like your operations and compare that to applicable operations for your site and those that are implemented. Review your sanitary and stormwater conveyance systems, confirm your discharge locations, your sample locations, identify if you're discharging into a receiving water or an MS4. For this particular site, our assessment revealed some of the following. So for the paperwork, the SWIP had not been updated. So when they got their permit, they had hired a consultant to put together a SWIP, and there had been some operational changes at the facility over the last 4 years. One of them was they brought in that fueling AST, and they did not include that in the SWIP. They didn't do an update. They had some people that had changed over that initially noted as their pollution prevention team, and they weren't there anymore. So those names were different. The figure had not been updated, and it was missing a few things. The discrete drainage areas were not outlined. Of course, that tank wasn't there, so that was missing. Maintenance records that are required under the permit, they didn't have everything, and they didn't have all of their training records. And because of COVID, they got their permit in 2020, about February. So, a month later, we all stopped. Things were difficult. There was a lot of employee turnover. So therefore, they missed a number of samples, and their documentation was very spotty from 2020 through 2021. Review of their monthly inspection forms showed that not all of them were signed by a corporate officer or delegated personnel. And then actually, their DMR that was on the water quality portal was missing parameters that they should have been analyzing for. And then there was actually one parameter that they didn't have to analyze for. And so this is, a big highlight here. Make sure your DMR, it covers all applicable parameters, those required by your next code. If you're discharging to a 303D listed water or a Puget Sound cleanup site, make sure that you are meeting those requirements. And on this slide is just a little highlight of what's called the Ecology Water Quality Atlas. You can go to that atlas and identify your discharge points and find out the quality of water that you're discharging to. So it'll identify if there's 303D listed. So back to our facility, because they were discharging to a Puget Sound sediment cleanup site, they're required to analyze catch basin solids once during the 5-year permit cycle, and they had not done that yet. The other thing is we reviewed all their analytical and their DMRs, and they had tripped a level 3 corrective action, and they didn't realize it because parameters are tallied facility-wide, not per drainage basin, like a number of people have been doing. It's very clear in this new permit, the 2025 permit, that parameters are tallied facility-wide, but it was actually effective in the last permit also. So the next slide, Molly. So some of the physical features for the site that were identified that were an issue, they had turbid stormwater runoff from their neighbors. They had cracked or alligator pavement that was holding dirt that would be released during high rain events. Dirt was being tracked from unpaved areas or that unpaved driveway onto their paved areas and causing turbidity in their stormwater. They definitely had tidal influence from the water. We pulled the manhole lids where the samples were collected, and sure enough, there was a high tide and water was totally backed up to the top of the manhole. They had a small shed that had a galvanized roof. They had equipment stored outside that was inhibiting the sweeper. They had a vacuum sweeper coming in monthly, but they could not get around a lot of the equipment. The stormwater cistern had not been cleaned. Catch basin inserts had been replaced on a pretty regular basis, but the sumps had never been cleaned. And there was an area of the stormwater system where there was some conveyance lines that were coming into catch basins and manholes, and it was unclear where they were originating from. And the last thing was their fueling area was not covered, nor was there a dead end sump or an oil water separator to capture spills. Okay, next slide. So you can do quite a bit in 60 days if you're, really moving, really checking the boxes. So we were able to update the SWIP and gather associated documents, including maintenance, as many as we could. Updated the pollution prevention team, did training of everybody on site that it was applicable. Verified and corrected that DMR parameters with the Department of Ecology, so it was corrected on the water quality portal. We also cleaned and cameraed their conveyance system. And during the camera operation, there was an illicit connection found. And it was a catch basin that was inside the transfer building that was supposed to go to sanitary, but unfortunately had been plumbed to stormwater. We were able to identify that it wasn't needed and plug it and decommission the catch basin. Installed filters and berms in and around all catch basins, able to move the sample points to different locations. Paperwork had to be submitted to ecology, but it was possible at this particular site. That's not always possible. They were did an inventory of all the equipment they had on site, and they got rid of unnecessary equipment with special attention to those that had galvanized components or greasy or leaky parts. Moved equipment indoors or covered it, and increased sweeping to weekly. And they implemented hand sweeping in those areas where the large vacuum sweeper could not get to. They then were able to identify that they had to do more upgrades to the site. They did need to repair the pavement. They were going to install berms to reject that stormwater from the neighbors back onto their site, install rumble strips prior to paved areas to hopefully knock off a lot of that dirt that was coming in from the big trucks' tires, paint a galvanized roof, and then cover that fueling area and install a dead end sump. Next slide. And as a result, we were able to get them into compliance, but then identify also that the facility did need some upgrades that were going to have to be initiated. They were able to submit a permit modification and technical justification to implement structural BMPs instead of going straight to treatment. They did choose to maintain compliance consultant support for a couple of years until their pollution prevention team was up to speed and knew exactly what they were doing. But they also assigned some very specific people that were available at least daily or weekly at the site to ensure all BMPs were implemented correctly. And then when it came to the third party, they were able to negotiate a settlement. They had to enter into a 3-year consent decree with that third party. They had to pay a supplemental environmental project that was negotiated but commensurate with the dollar amount of potential violations. And they had to pay attorney fees for the third party. And they will have to quarterly update that third party and keep them appraised of any interactions with ecology or ISG permit compliance.